Truth. Building on the rock. Back to that whole idea. Faith. Trust. It said that she received strength, and the word is dunamis. Like when it says the Holy Spirit will come upon you and you'll receive dunamis. I love this stuff. That when she said, he's faithful, and she actually believed it and got on with it, she was empowered. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
I'm in. Okay. Here's the strength to do your part. It's like faith accesses it. 2 Timothy 2:13. Russ, you want to grab that one? And then we're just going to, let's read a couple verses. Are you in Genesis there? Are you still in Genesis, David?
Yeah.
Could be. Genesis 18. Get ready for verses 13, 14, and 15. She judged him faithful. 2 Timothy 2:13.
If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself.
One more time.
If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself.
That's on top of it. Brother Paul's on top of it when he's talking with Timothy. He says, listen, I get this, but if God said it, he's faithful. We're faithless, but he's faithful. That is just like, oh, be still my heart. In Genesis, we're not going to go through and read the story of Sarah and Abraham. She gets pregnant and all that kind of stuff. Basically, it's in 17 and 18, and then she has Isaac over in chapter 21. But in chapter 18, verses 13, 14, and 15, this is when the angels appear, and they repeat the promise that they made to Abraham in the previous chapter. Well, actually, the Lord made the previous chapter. But this time Sarah hears the prophecy, basically, the promise, whichever word you want to use. Chapter 18, verses 13, 14, and 15.
And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah denied it, however, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh.
That's a great story, isn't it? I didn't laugh. Yes, you did.
You did. When he started, did not, did too, did not.
It's beautiful. It is so.
Just makes
One
me
of
think
these.
of that kind of thing.
One of these weeks we're going to have to do that story, because it's just got like so much beauty to it. But the reason I referred to it tonight was not the laughing part of it, but that question: is anything too difficult, too hard for the Lord? That's the question that's asked. Not even talking about how faithful he is. The question is anything too difficult for him? Now, we talked about his ways, his will, his wisdom, and we put it in a whole different context than ours, than man's. A whole different place. Same question, same thing is said to Mary. With God, when she's questioning about, Jesus bearing a son, she's a virgin. When Gabriel says, with God, nothing will be impossible. Jesus, at one point in his ministry, with God, all things are possible. All those things right there, to me, were things that Sarah was able to get a hold of down the line and say, he's faithful. She receives strength. She gets her Isaac and laughs her pretty little head off. I love it. I love that little story where she's like laughing and saying, can you believe it? If somebody would have said I would be nursing a baby at my age.
How old was she? Did they ever say how old she was?
I think she was 90. I think she was 10 years younger than Abram. Abram was 100. I think she was 90.
Wow. That is pretty old to be having kids.
Yes, to be starting your family. You're never too late to start, that's what I say. Anyway, back to Hebrews 11. Now, when we get to 13, 14, 15, and 16, the writer all of a sudden, it's kind of interesting, the writer makes this blanket statement about everybody that they've talked about so far. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah. Why don't you go ahead and read those 4 verses, 13 through 16.
All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them, and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
The words that jump out at me particularly are what they're seeking and what they desire. And though they're on this planet, they're not on this planet. And I think knowing the Lord's direction, I think sometimes our pursuits are really worthless. They're temporal, they're meaningless, quite frankly. And we just drop our eyes off the real purpose and everything else, and we get all caught up in something that really doesn't matter because we're seeking something that doesn't matter, and our desires are relatively screwed up. Now, we didn't talk a lot about that in our summary, but these guys here, all of a sudden, they're all lumped together. So there's something they all had in common, which was what they were seeking and what they desired. And I got a funny feeling that based on what they were seeking, which we might call prayer, the way they prayed, the way they walked with God, all of that, the Lord's direction was, it really was like following the Lord. I mean, if they were sitting here, they might say, but it was just so obvious. Every step. Anyway, let's finish up. Verses 17, 18, and 19 close down Abraham and Sarah, and those are the last verses we're going to read. Are there any other verses to be read? Let's just do 17, 18, and 19 in Hebrews 11. See what we got.
By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your descendants shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type.
So it's referring to that time, Genesis 22, when God asks Abraham to take Isaac, his son, to Mount Moriah and to offer him up. That's what the writer is referring to. We know that in the story, Abraham is totally obedient, and with the knife in the air, the angel of the Lord stops him. So this is the incident that the writer of Hebrews is referring to. I don't know of anybody who doesn't still, whether you read it, hear it, whatever, it kind of sends your little head into a tailspin. I mean, to the point where some Bible scholars say, well, that was put in there in the Jewish tradition, but it never really happened. You know, there's that kind of, because I think it's just way, way, way too hard to get our heads around. Now for the Jews it's really difficult because they don't accept Jesus Christ, God giving his only begotten son, so that makes it a little bit tricky. The point being, we talked about when Jesus was in the garden, knowing full well exactly what was supposed to happen, and offers up a prayer that says, I know all things are possible. And we talked about that. But, you know, if you could take this cup away from me, if there's something else there. But nevertheless, not my will, but thy will. In other words, we said that week that sometimes it's really hard to see the good in something. Jesus demonstrated that to us. It's really hard. Here in Genesis 22, it's really hard when you're reading that story to see the good in this whole thing, to even tie God into the picture. In Genesis 22, there's a couple verses that become, kind of important. One of them makes it very clear. I know you probably have all heard people preach on Genesis 22 that it was a test of faith. When it says in the beginning he tested them, it was a test of faith. Other people say it was a test of love because he said, take your son who you love. That's not what the text says, though. The text says, when he stops him from sacrificing his son, he says, now I know that you fear the Lord. In other words, after all the time that Abraham walked with God, what this comes down to is, where is Abraham at when it comes to the fear of the Lord, which is not being afraid of God, but getting on with following God and doing what God says, even though I can't see the good in it. I've got to be honest with you. I'm lost in this one. But the Hebrews text is interesting because it says, you know what? Abram was able to say, God said that he'd give me a son, and there would come generations from him. If he says to sacrifice Isaac, he's obviously going to raise him from the dead, because you can't do both. And he said this, I don't care what this looks like, I don't get it, but this is what we're doing. And the writer of Hebrews is not coming right out and saying that Abram had a vision of Christ and the resurrection, but he was sort of getting something that gave him a type of a prophetic picture of something that God was going to do ultimately that Abraham and his son couldn't. It would be a worthless waste of a life. Abram had become a father. He had fulfilled spiritual maturity and mentorship, if you would. He's a father. He has a son. It becomes a very outrageous kind of picture and everything. For us, knowing the Lord's direction, like we said, sometimes it's hard to see the good. But he concluded. He reckoned. He put the whole thing together, which we talked about before. Judgment into action. And he conceived of resurrection, of God raising him from the dead. That's what it says in Hebrews 11. Which is a pretty outrageous kind of call to make. Because I'll tell you what, when the knife comes down, that's very, very real. And I'm standing on something.
Had anybody been raised from the dead yet
No.
at that point?
No.
So
It was as wild a conjecture as Noah saying water's going to come from the sky, like we said last week. Oh, you guys, like we talked about last week. You got to remember, Noah was preaching a gospel that said water was going to come from the sky. Water never came from the sky. It always came from the earth. We had somebody here last week who was saying, she's a psychologist, and she was talking about how she tries to, within the limits of what her job will afford her, the opportunity to share the gospel, because she talks to people who have a lot of problems. And she knows, as a Christian woman, that the only hope, the only shot they've got is Jesus. And she said it's absolutely amazing how they reject the only hope they've got. And so I just said to her last week, with all due respect, you're talking about water coming from the sky. You're talking about something that is so far removed from their thought process, the way they live, the way they think, what they... It is so far removed, you might as well be telling them the flood's coming.
Hmm.
They're not buying it. They're looking back at you and saying, excuse me, water comes from the earth. My nourishment comes from this earth. You're trying to tell me my nourishment, living waters are going to come from the sky? I don't think so. So it's kind of interesting with Noah having that kind of a message, doing what he's doing. And we've got a few chapters later, Abraham having a revelation of the resurrection. Where does that come from? You know what I mean? These are outrageous thoughts. The truth is that both the guys, if they don't go in that direction that they've received from God, that doesn't make any sense, that they can't see the good in, they don't come to the point of having those revelations which actually get you to the next dot kind of thing. So, I think that'll do it, for tonight in terms of still trying to put together the summary with some of these examples. There's no way we can go through the whole Bible, so to speak, and try to see how we could apply the various points in the summary.